This session is a kind of representation of some of the diversity of contents of the first issue of the journal. And if you haven't got to it yet, we've tried this. You can get to it. You can get to the PDFs. You can download them onto your phone or wherever you want to download them to. So it's all, you could be downloading and reading at the same time as you're hearing these people speak, which could be challenging, I think. No, don't do that. That's a bad idea. So we've got Cary, who's going to be talking about really a very new kind of area of inquiry, the sort of things we've been discussing in relation to early years learning and cultural experience. We've got Alejandro talking, where is he? Oh, there he is, talking about the relationship between film education and the institution from the Austrian Film Institute. We have got Alexis, who is over here. Who's going to be talking about his contribution to the first issue, which is a debate with Alan Bergala's manifesto, effectively. So each of these people will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we've got about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So hold your thoughts till then, and we'll have a discussion. And they'll all keep very strictly to their time, because I haven't brought my green, amber, and red cards with me, so I'm not able to wave them at them. Though I might sort of wave agitatedly at them if they start to stray. So first of all, can I introduce Cary Bazalgette, former head of education at the British Film Institute, to talk about her research.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks. Could we dim the lights a little bit, please? Because you're going to be looking at some pictures. So I'm going to start by showing. Can we have the first slide? Yeah. I wanted to show you some of the kinds of answers that you might give, or that I've heard given when people like administrators or hostile policymakers say, so what's the point of film education? And these might be some of the things that come up. I'm sure you can think of other things as well. But actually, I'm not showing these in order to start a debate about it. Is this microphone working? It doesn't sound like it is. It is? Okay, fine. What a good one. I'm showing you this in order to point out that each one of these possible responses reveals some sort of implicit assumptions about what learners bring to it. And many of those assumptions are going to be about deficits. So it'll be like, children don't have critical skills, or, learners are unfamiliar with canonical texts. And teachers certainly don't necessarily have a great deal of time to figure out or find out what their students' prior learning is that what they might know before they come into the classroom. They tend to be dependent on their own assumptions, and that's understandable. But I do want to argue that prior learning, I think, is pretty important. Can we have the next slide? Like the scholars that I've referenced here, by the way, I'm putting in references to all these slides, but I'm not expecting you to read them now. They're just there in case you wanted a copy of the PowerPoint later and wanted to follow things up. So just, you don't have to read them in detail. But anyway, like these scholars, I believe that learning has to start from where the learners are. But in this paper, as you'll know from my title, I'm not going to be talking about undergraduate or teenage or even primary school learners. I'm going to be talking about people a lot younger than that. And I hope I'm going to persuade you that if we want to understand more about learning, about viewing practices in general, or even about our own responses to films, then it's interesting and it's useful if we know more about the beginnings of film education. It's the largely self-taught learning that's going on right now in living rooms and kitchens, wherever kids have access to TVs or DVDs or iPads. Wherever that's available, that learning is going on. And by the way, I'm going to refer to both film and TV as movies. That's my word, because it's quicker. Anyway, my research has convinced me there's a lot more going on when little children watch movies than is generally assumed. Next slide. I got into this research because I believe, as I suppose all of you do, that movies do employ codes and conventions that have to be learned, but also because I was intrigued by the kind of indicators that I've listed here. All of these suggest that that learning must begin very, very early. When I was at the BFI, and I'm sure some of you have had this experience as well, I met primary school teachers who were really resistant to teaching film in the classroom. not sure I'm allowed to do that, or what would be the point of it? And soon they changed their minds when they started. And the big thing was that the children's responses made them realise that in many cases they had misjudged what their pupils knew and what they were capable of. And this made me think there must have been prior learning that schools weren't understanding or recognising. The last point there, though, is one that I've just made up, but it's coming from my own experience. And in a way, it's probably the most salient argument for looking at the age group that I'm roughly characterising as 2-year-olds. We know that children of less than, say, 2.5 even maybe, they won't just sit and watch a whole feature film. They can't follow that through. They find that quite difficult. They might enjoy bits of it and watch those over and over again. When they get older, let's say 3.5, then they can. They're probably likely they can watch a whole family movie, with their siblings or friends, and appear to enjoy quite a lot of it. So my question is, what happens in between? And how would we find out? This is the next slide. I know this is an even busier slide, but just look at the bits in bold, okay? It's not actually surprising that hardly anybody's ever attempted to study 2-year-olds' relationship with movies, or possibly nobody apart from me. Studying 2-year-olds is notoriously difficult, especially if you don't want to use methods that... I love this quote from Bronfenbrenner. The science... This is lab experiments with 2-year-olds, the science of the strange behaviour of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest possible periods of time. It's not going to work. So the alternative, okay, must be to do longitudinal ethnographic studies. But home life with 2-year-olds is a bit chaotic, and it's hard to understand what they're doing unless you're very close to the families involved. Nevertheless, a lot of scholars have observed that this really is the only way to gain in-depth understanding of what 2-year-olds are up to. So it follows logically that such studies are best done by family members who have a better chance of understanding what the children are saying, for a start, and recognising much more subtle features of their behaviour. So what I did was study my own twin grandchildren from when they were 22 months old until they were 3.5. Have the next slide. So what I'm going to do now is... Actually, what I'm going to do now is have a drink of water. What I'm going to do now is to describe 3 aspects of my initial observations of the children. The thing that actually triggered my decision to try and do a PhD was observing 3 instances of what seemed to me and to the children's parents to be kind of inappropriate or mistaken responses to movies. So the first 2 events happened actually quite a while before I started my research, when the twins were 13 months old. First of all, both children were extremely distressed by an episode of In the Night Garden when a character called Mr. Pontipine loses his moustache. Don't ask, but it flies around the garden and it looks a bit like a moth or a bat, and they were just really horrified by that. And then the next day, Alfie was very upset by another episode of In the Night Garden when, there's a character called Makapaka. Okay, stay with me on this. And he has a little tricycle sort of thing that he pushes along that's called an ogpog. And one day the ogpog is parked somewhere, but it gets away and it runs down the hill. And for older kids, 2.5-year-olds, that's pretty amusing. It's quite funny, and everybody chases after it. It's really nice. Alfie thought it was terrible. He was really upset. And then the third event of this kind, and I saw this one, and this is the one I've illustrated here, was when they were just 2 and 1 week. And it involved a tug-of-war scene in a Peppa Pig episode when the rope breaks and everyone falls over, which, if you know Peppa Pig, that's a standard trope. And the picture here shows Connie watching this for about the 2nd or 3rd time, and you can see that her hands are clenched and she's chewing her cheek because she's waiting for that moment when the rope breaks and she knows she's going to start screaming and throw herself on the floor. And an interesting thing about this was that over the next few weeks, she deliberately watched that episode several times again until she managed to get it down to just going like that and left out the screaming. So she was studying it for herself. But what I wanted to say here was that these events reflect what Jerome Kagan says about 1-year-olds, that they are, it's complicated this, they are sensitive to events that appear to contrast with those which adults have indicated are proper. Okay, so toys broken, stained your clothes, torn something. That's a major disaster for 1-year-olds. They get very, very upset about it. But the interesting thing about these episodes is, to me, what Kagan would call the proper places or states of the moustache and the ogpog and the rope weren't established by adults that the children knew. They were established by the movie narrative. So what's indicated here is that even at 13 months, they had some partial understanding of the narrative and the intentions of the narrative. They misread its generic intentions, but they did understand something. And the fact that these sorts of reactions mostly stopped soon after they turned 2 not only bears out Kagan's argument that this is only a second year of life phenomenon, but also as they went into their 3rd year, they were developing their comprehension of narratives, in particular generic features that signal humour. So they were able, for example, when they were about 2.5, to laugh spontaneously at something in Teletubbies. Laughter comes quite late. You need to understand narrative and genre to be able to laugh at a movie. Next slide, please. The second thing I observed, and this was much more pervasive and longer lasting, was the way the children invested incredibly intense and sustained attention to movies, or more likely to parts of movies. So here you can see Alfie. He's 22 months old and he's in a characteristic pose. He's gazing intently. He's close to the screen, so it's filling his field of vision. He's maintaining his steady position by bracing his hands against the TV trolley, because if your head is that big, you need to hold on to something to keep it steady. And when I had different filming positions that showed more of their faces, which didn't necessarily happen very often, the videos often revealed that they were frowning and open-mouthed as they concentrated on what they were watching. And sometimes you would see them breathing quite deeply. You could see their little shoulders and chest going up and down. And they wouldn't necessarily both do this with the same bits of a movie or the same movie. They would each choose the movies or parts of movies that they wanted to pay close attention to. Sometimes they both watched, but not necessarily always. So I think the important point here is not just that they were extraordinarily attentive, often for what's an extended period for a 2-year-old, like 7 minutes, but also that this was self-directed. They decided what was important and salient for them. Okay, next slide, thank you. The third thing I observed was a great deal of viewing in the social context of 2 or more family members present while they watched. And this didn't always happen, but when it did, I think it contributed in many ways to the children's viewing experiences and their growing understanding. So there might be conscious contributions like this, where their mother is modelling something that's happening in I can't remember what it was. But it also might be that the co-viewers are making almost kind of involuntary utterances, the kind of thing you do when there's toddlers around. You go, ooh, wow, look at that. And I was amazed how much of that went on. It was quite embarrassing. Or they may be just commenting about the movie to each other and they're ignoring the kids. But all the time they're doing that, they are as well modelling the family practice of movie viewing. So that, they're saying this is how we watch movies in our family, whatever it is. In this particular family, it was a lot to do with, well, movies are really important to us, and we sit down and we watch them through to the end. And I think also the other thing, there's sort of playful engagement with movies. When they were talking to the kids, they might say something like, so do you think that could really happen? And that's contributing to the children's growing ability to make modality judgments, to judge, so what's real and what's pretend. And that, again, links up to children's practices in play, where the rules about what's true and what's pretend are really clear and are established by the children themselves. Okay, can we have the next slide? When I analysed the video material, I used an embodied cognition approach. And if you're familiar with that, you'll find this slide ludicrously oversimplified. But for my purposes here, I just want to pull out 2 key arguments from embodied cognition that I found really useful in helping me to figure out what the children were doing. The first one's a key principle of embodied cognition. In other words, Descartes was wrong. And I've just listed a few of the texts that spell out that argument more fully. I think switching back to adults and children and movies, if we can consider how people tend to talk about very small children, actually in general, not just movies, we can see that Cartesian dualism is still alive and well in a lot of contemporary discourse. So people tend to see babies and toddlers as behaving instinctively, as being ruled by their emotions. They haven't yet learned to control their passions, as Descartes would say. Their intellects aren't yet fully developed, hence the tantrums and the irrational behaviour. So it's been a big boost to embodied cognition that over the last 30 years or so, neuroscientists like Panksepp, who I've quoted here, have been producing a much more nuanced account of how instinctive states such as emotions are in fact deeply bound up with cognitive operations and have always played a crucial role in human evolution and survival. We'll have the next slide, please. And I'm drawing on Panksepp again for this slide because it was his concept of the seeking emotion that I found useful in thinking about what was happening when the children were investing so much energy in attentively viewing and reviewing particular movies. In this picture, they're 2 years and 9 months old, and they're watching a 5.5-minute animated film called Anima 2 for about the 10th time. It's not a movie made for children, although it involves the well-known trope of a cat chasing a mouse. It's a film festival intro movie that shows different animation techniques. It doesn't have much of a narrative and there's no resolution. But I think the children's responses to it, as you can see them here, even though by now they know it very well, they're a good illustration of what Panksepp says about seeking, the emotion that drives you to explore and to find out and to learn. You see how Connie's leaning forward, she's open-mouthed, she's excited, look at her gaze, she's excitedly anticipating the bit that comes next. I can't remember what the bit was, but she loved to say, this is the bit where, this is what happens now. Alfie is thinking hard. I say that not only because of that characteristic expression, but because when the film ends, a bit after this, his granddad says, so, did the cat catch the mouse? And Alfie pauses for a moment and he says, almost. Which I think is a fantastic one-word summary of an entire genre. Not just Tom and Jerry, but Roadrunner, Bugs Bunny, the Keystone Cops. And he's, that's the point of the humour in that. At this stage, they still hadn't used up Anima 2. Now, used up is the phrase my daughter came up with when we started feeling that, when we used terms like, oh, well, they love it, or, oh, he's bored with it, that they weren't adequate to describe the children's relationship with movies, and they're describing it purely in terms of affect. So we used this term, decided that used up was a much better way of explaining it. And the other way that adults characterize children's habit of reviewing movies is to use medicalized terms like, she's mesmerized by it, or he's addicted to it. And all of those kinds of comments, both the affect and the medicalized ones, they take us back to Cartesian dualism. They characterize children as ruled by their emotions or vulnerable to forces that they're too innocent to resist. The seeking concept, which Panksepp said has always been essential to human survival, seems a much better way of describing children's relationship with the movies they're interested in. They weren't reviewing Anima 2 because they loved it or because they were obsessed by it. They reviewed it because it offered them an interesting challenge, and they went on finding new things to understand each time they watched it until they'd really exhausted its possibilities. And I noticed, in fact, that the movies they latched onto and wanted to review often tended to be ones that were at the edge of their ability to understand things. I don't mean they were becoming little film buffs seeking out esoteric minority fare. I'm talking about mainstream stuff as well, but things might have been too long or too complex, you would have thought, for them to follow. But simply their movie viewing was a bit like what Vygotsky says about children's play. He says, in play, a child always behaves beyond his average age, above his daily behaviour. In play, it is as though he were a head taller than himself. Seeing the children's viewing as a learning process, willingly undertaken and largely self-directed, links up with this paper that I've quoted here by Leslie Lancaster, which is not about movies at all, but it's about a 2-year-old doing drawings with her dad, I beg your pardon. Lancaster suggests that in engaging with symbolic meaning systems, children have expectations of significance. I think that's a great phrase. They're deliberately and voraciously seeking out meaning. And of course, this is also encouraged by their social context. Let's not forget that the 3rd year of life is also the year in which children become more or less fluent speakers. But it's learning both how to mean and how to interpret meaning is the centre of their lives. And one of the ways they tackled movies that were new to them was to operate what Hanna Wojciechowski calls diacrisis. They would identify features of the movie that they found salient and use them as a kind of provisional template to figure out, to keep them going through the narrative, to figure out what was going on. But I think also that links back, way back to the distressed response events that I was talking about earlier. They saw things then that distressed them, and they because they couldn't deal with that, they overrode everything else. So for very young viewers, maybe diacrisis can lead to what we would judge as misinterpretation of the movie. Last slide, thank you. So finally, I just want to pull together the features I've been talking about. These are the 6 main things that I think are happening when 2-year-olds watch movies. And I think when you see these together, you can get a sense of the complexity of movie watching, because I don't think these activities are confined to 2-year-olds. If we allow for older learners wider experience and knowledge, I think it may be useful to reflect on how these six things play out in later life. Of course, there are a few differences. We may not, quite often may not be watching with co-viewers, but we do have social media to affect our interpretation. And we've got stylistic and generic knowledge that helps us make judgments about the reality status of what we watch. We don't depend on pretend play much anymore, I think. And we do like new challenges in what we watch. We seek things out that are going to give us a new experience. And we may not review movies as much as 2-year-olds do. We may not watch everything 20 times. But we do like to follow drama series, and we like to collect box sets. So maybe we're not as different from 2-year-olds as we like to think. And as Jamie said this morning, you go on studying film, whatever else you do. I think it's just useful to remember that we started early. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Cary. So again, save your questions till the end and we'll have a discussion when we wrap up the session. So I'm pleased to introduce Alejandro Bachmann, who's come all the way from Vienna to talk to us about the relationship between film education and the institution. Alejandro.
So yes, hello, and first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy and honored to be part of this first conference, but also part of the Film Education Journal, because I really think that what it aims at is something that should be, fulfilled sooner, better than later. What I will talk about is a paper I wrote together with Manuel Zahn, who's a professor for education and aesthetics, I would say, at the University of Cologne, and with whom I have worked in film educational context for many years. And so the paper I will be giving here is really just a shorter form of that longer paper that you can read about, and just entails more theory parts and 2 case studies, while the paper I will be giving will focus on 1 case study, which is the Film Museum, the place I work for. So over the last 10 years, Alain Bergala's, and maybe I should also say that my slides really just work as little hooks for you to know where I'm at. So it's really just basically the terms I'm currently speaking about during my paper that you will see up there, so you can always get back to them when you lose your thought while I lose my thought. Okay, so, and I will just give you a sign for next, yeah, okay, cool. Next slide. Okay. Over the last 10 years, Alain Bergala's The Cinema Hypothesis has become the center of attention for a significant number of people involved in film education practices aiming to teach film in its own right, rather than using it as a tool for other pedagogical means or aims. In this way, it has done exactly what it set out to do. Quote by Bergala, to convince those who want to hear it that such a goal is attainable, to help them in attaining it if they wish to do so, and to accept all the consequences which truly are immense of truly regarding cinema as an art, unquote. Me and my colleague Manuel Zahn, with whom I've written the article that this small paper is based on, both worked extensively with the cinema hypothesis, ranging from seminars at university and workshops with children to summer schools aimed at enabling teachers to integrate film and film education into their daily context in the classroom. While we both remain thankful for and generally in agreement with the ideas outlined by Bergala, we have come across various problems when integrating his ideas into the context of our own teaching. This observation is the point of departure for this paper, which wants to suggest a media-ecological perspective on film education that will allow us to not only look at the teaching effort itself and the theory behind it, but also at how far it is shaped by its context and how far it is relational to the shape it takes place in. To the space it takes place in. So something that Cary, I think, just has done as well when talking about film and very young children. In the following, we take into account our own practices of teaching film and position them in relation to the ideas outlined by Bergala. Our aim is to shift the way we look at and reflect on film education away from one text towards a multiplicity of different practices. This is not to suggest that Bergala's ideas fall short of practical realities, but rather to illustrate how every form of film education is embedded in and thus influenced by its regional context, which both limits and facilitates its specific implementation. Each of these practices then could be considered as theorizations, limited in their scope but rich in their specificity. The concept of small regional theorizations is here thought of in close proximity to Donna Haraway's theory of situated knowledge. In her seminal essay, Situated Knowledges, the Science Question in Feminism and the Privilege of Partial Perspective, she takes as a starting point the conditionality of scientific knowledge. Thus, the social situatedness, as well as the researcher's advantages derived from a certain context, are put into a relation to the research as a whole. Situated knowledge is thus always already perceived as locally limited and can never be translated as being universal. Next. Let me just check if we are. Yeah, well, okay. So next I want to talk about three terms that Bergala also talks about. The fact that Bergala opens the cinema hypothesis with a chapter entitled "The Experience Has Been Rewarding" is significant. Bergala's body of ideas is grounded in a certain context that he outlines himself and that is constituted from his time as chief editor of the Cahiers du Cinéma, an assignment he'd received from French cultural minister Jacques Lang to come up with an approach to teaching cinema within the French school system, and the dominance of the DVD medium at the time, to name just a few. At the center of Bergala's theory stands the concept of the passeur. Quote, "A passeur is someone who gives of himself, who accompanies his passengers in the boat or up the mountain, who takes the same risks as those temporarily in his charge," unquote. It is important to understand what this entails. Bergala's idea of film education is not primarily based on a certain knowledge that must be passed from teacher to student through analyzing a film, or revealing its hidden ideological message, but rather on the notion of an individual experience that the student gains through an encounter with film as an art form, and that can be, or rather has to be, shaped by the teacher. It is he or she as a subject who takes up responsibility for the films that he or she is showing, a subject that puts up his or her own passion and excitement for the object. The other term that plays a seminal role in the cinema hypothesis is taste. This comes into play when Bergala, rightfully I would say, criticizes a film educational approach that sets out to arm children against the powers of manipulation in their encounter with the cinematic medium. Quote, "If one is successful with films whose artistic value is incontestable in reconstructing something that resembles taste, one will have accomplished more towards fighting bad or dangerous films than by trying first to hastily apply some partial tools of defensive criticism," unquote. In that line of thought, it does not come as a surprise that Bergala expresses a skepticism towards institutions that in their very nature are not built upon the ideal of subjectivity, but rather establish structures that create stability and consistency independent of the subjects working within them. As Bergala says, the institution has a natural tendency to standardize, to amortize, indeed to absorb that element of risk represented by an encounter with any form of otherness, in order to reassure itself and to reassure its agents, unquote. The passeur, with his or her notion of taste, then embodies that very otherness that disturbs the institution, be that a school, a university, or a film museum, because what he or she teaches is intrinsically bound to his or her passion as well as taste. As I now want to show, it might be helpful to look at institutions differently, to look beyond Bergala's conception of institutions as rigid, monolithic blocks that stand in the way of teaching film passionately, and rather to see the institution as something that is itself made up of contexts, practices, subjects, materials, and media that collectively add up to a flexible context whose very existence facilitates and makes possible encounters with film. Next one, please. So the conditions of practice. If we stick with Bergala's emphasis on the subject, on the passeur's capability to bring him or herself into the act of teaching, with his or her passions and personal relation to film, and if at the same time we do not want to downplay the role of the institution or regard it as something standing in the way of the passeur, we could try to describe a teaching subject in its entanglement with an institution. This would allow us to describe a specific approach to film education and, at the same time, understand the conditions of its practice and the practice itself. Something I have described earlier as small regional theorizations. So each of these practices we look at could be considered to be one theorization of film education. These conditions of its practice can range from material realities, such as the space in which film is being taught, the technical equipment available and the size of the room, to organizational matters, at what time of day film is being taught and whether students come on their own or in a class context, and, last but not least, include the philosophy or mission of an institution, which will impact the specific form that teaching takes in a specific context. Thus, our theoretical perspective could be thought of in close proximity to a media-ecological perspective, which has seen a significant rise in impact in media studies over the last couple of years. A central paradigm of media-ecological thinking is the radical affirmation of being relational rather than being individual. The media-ecological perspective suggested here thus expands educational theories within the field of media pedagogy, sociology and psychology in at least two dimensions. On the one hand, the social relationships between people are opened up to the role of non-human actors. On the other hand, it allows for the processes of communication and education to be thought of not only as symbolic imaginary arrangements of perception, emotion and articulation, but also as an ongoing interplay between architectures, materials and bodies. Next one, please. So I will now try to basically apply this idea of a media-ecological perspective to Bergala and the Austrian Film Museum at the same time. So I basically want to look at Bergala through what we do at the Austrian Film Museum. Cinematheques and film museums can be particularly fruitful case studies to understand how the teaching subject is always already embedded into a structure that influences and shapes his or her specific teaching practice. Because these institutions have quite often been founded by one overly passionate person with the intention to be places of film education. Think, for example, of Henri Langlois and the Cinémathèque Française. The Austrian Film Museum is no exception. Founded in 1964 by Peter Kohnlechner, a student at the Technical University of Vienna, and Peter Kubelka, an Austrian avant-garde filmmaker, the Film Museum was conceptualized from the start as a place where people could come into contact with film in all of its possible shapes and forms, and where film could be shown, preserved, restored, and taught. So what are the pillars of this institution's understanding of film education? And there are obviously a lot of pillars, but I will try to talk about three of them. First, next slide, please. While film as an important independent art form stood at the center of this idea of founding the Film Museum from the start, there was also an urge to show other modes of screen production, ranging from documentary and experimental cinema to ephemeral forms such as advertising, industrial film and amateur filmmaking. The Film Museum was intended to, and still does, show film as an art form, as a document, but also as a purely non-commercial means of personal expression or as a tool to record your summer vacation. Next. The center of such a place had to be a cinema that was to be the exhibition space of a museum. Film was not to be exhibited and thus taught through its objects and paratexts, such as the camera, a costume, the screenplay, or old movie posters, but only through the projection of the film itself in an ideal setting, the cinema. Next. In 1995, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of film, Peter Kubelka also put together a cycle of films consisting of 63 programs which were screened each Tuesday. The title of that cycle, What is Film?, once again emphasizes that the didactic concept of its co-founder and, subsequently, the institution itself. The answer to the question of what film is can only be given by the films themselves, by a program that encompasses about 300 films that need to be seen on the cinema screen. Accordingly, Kubelka was against a publication to accompany the cycle and, although giving in, stated, "I am not against teaching film. I do it myself quite often, even in the context of my own works. But I do think that the Film Museum should favor those people who want to see those works in their original form and without any comments. We are currently in a situation where everything is being taught through language. It is like an epidemic. Galleries publish a book accompanying every exhibition, guided tours are offered and lectures are being held. Everything is being taught. Teaching art covers up the thing itself and takes away its possibility to speak for itself. What we get is the illusion of understanding based on language. One can only understand music through listening, food through eating, film through film itself." That was a quote by Peter Kubelka. So this is the context that we had to develop film educational materials in, or film educational programs in. What has been outlined so far could be summed up as the conditions of practice for film education at the Austrian Film Museum, its philosophy as an institution as well as its material realities. It is within these conditions that specific film education practices have been developed, one of which, the lectures within the School in the Cinema series, will be outlined in what follows and placed in relation to these conditions as well as to the ideas outlined in the cinema hypothesis. The School in the Cinema series is one module within the larger program of activities that the Austrian Film Museum has started developing since 2002. Currently, it offers up to 20 events each semester consisting of a variety of formats. One element is the so-called lectures. These are 2 hours long, take place inside the cinema and encompass topics including manipulation in cinema from silence to sound, time machine cinema and the temporal experience, and film as rhythm, and many others. Up to 164 children or teenagers can participate, and the 2 hours are composed of a mixture of excerpts from films or shorter works in their entirety and an analysis that is intended to happen in a dialogue between the passeur and the audience. Next. So 2 central aspects of Bergala's thinking inform these lectures, although these aspects require assimilation into the conditions within the Austrian Film Museum discussed above. When Bergala names one of his central concerns as being the imperative to make cinema visible as an art form, this is, in his case, closely connected to another element of his pedagogy, that is to make students think of film as an imprint of a creative process. Quote, "Perhaps we should begin, though it won't be an easy task pedagogically, by thinking of film not as an object but as the final imprint of a creative process and by thinking of cinema as an art," unquote. This approach cannot be applied directly to the understanding of film embodied by the Film Museum. In its aim to make people understand that film encompasses many different forms, the educational lectures always try to integrate industrial films, trailers, or amateur films, none of which are easily comprehended as the imprint of creativity, but rather as an imprint of an urge to remember, an urge to create interest, or to simply document. The perspective thus has to change from trying to find the filmmaker's ideas and intentions to making young people sensitive to what they feel and think and how they react, and how this might be brought about by the aesthetic cues and traces of the films. One should not mistake this approach for being at odds with Bergala's call for the development of a taste, however. Film history is full of beautiful examples of films that were never intended to be creative, but nevertheless still carry what Bergala himself defines to be that moment when, quote, "emotion and thought are born out of a form, a rhythm that could not have existed but for cinema," unquote. What is at stake here is, quite simply, a different set of conditions of practice between that of a writer, cinephile, occasional filmmaker, and magazine editor growing up in the realms of the Cahiers du Cinéma, working close to people like Godard and writing about Rossellini, and that of an institution with an understanding of film history that encompasses the great auteurs as well as ephemeral forms of film. So while the lectures at the Film Museum are trying to build a taste by making connections between works, these connections break up distinctions between that which is deemed art by the cinephile and that which is deemed worthy of attention to a museum curator. Accordingly, the lectures at the Film Museum try to integrate two other elements of the conditions of practice discussed above: an understanding of the cinema space as a specific arena and apparatus for experiencing films, as well as a sense for the material realities of film that become relevant when being involved with an archive and the practices of preservation and restoration. So while watching the film and making the audience sensitive to the specific power of cinema as a means of expression is the starting point for these lectures, an effort to reflect on the specific conditions of the cinema in comparison to mobile phones or a home cinema setup is always part of any film education activity. To conclude, what has been discussed in this paper is first and foremost, we believe, a confirmation of the ideas and concepts that Alain Bergala brings together in the cinema hypothesis. The idea of the passeur and the concept of taste stand at the center of Bergala's way of teaching cinema and have an influence on a variety of other choices and goals, ranging from the choice of films to the didactic approaches and expected outcomes of the educational processes. We have also attempted to expand these concepts through a shift of theoretical perspective that tries to integrate Bergala's ideas of the passeur into a media-ecological approach. It is our assertion that the basic notion of the passeur, which is so central to Bergala's thinking, should be expanded in relation to the conditions of practice of different contexts for film education. These conditions of practice should not be thought of as a second level influencing the individual taste and abilities of the passeur. On the contrary, the idea is to understand taste and everything else that makes up a passeur as being already mediated by an infrastructure of perceptions, affect, and actions of human and non-human actors. Institutions can be seen as one part of these infrastructures. The conditions of practice of a given institution thus shape what we perceive as an individual taste or a specific approach to teaching in terms of both limitations and affordances, and are thus central to understanding any given project of film education. Every description of a practical film education initiative, therefore, always remains regional or situated, that is limited, and at the same time precise, that is detailed. A media-ecological perspective of film education gives us the possibility to find and map these complex institutional, material, technological, mediated and social conditions of practice and emphasize their differences. The approach we discuss here suggests that in order to get there, it might make sense to collect descriptions of existing projects and relate them to their specific contexts, and only then find out if a common nucleus is shared between them. This also implies that what we might find is that there hardly is a common and shared understanding of what film is and of how it can be taught. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alejandro. And now Alexis Gibbs from the University of Winchester is going to give a talk based on his contribution to the first issue of the journal. So Bergala from another perspective, I think.
Thank you. Are you going to... That's very helpful. It might be a test of my coordination, but... Hello. Yeah, my name is Alexis Gibbs. I've kind of stepped in at the last minute to talk about my contribution to the journal. So this presentation has been sort of slightly hastily put together, and it's not very well practiced, so forgive me. I'm very grateful to be here. I sort of felt like maybe a bit of an imposter in doing this beforehand, because my background is not as someone who works as a film pedagogue as such. I work in an education studies department at the University of Winchester, where I have tried to introduce thinking about film into our curriculum, both on an undergraduate program in education studies and now in philosophy of education at master's level as well. My thinking around this does come very much from the perspective of thinking about philosophy and how film philosophizes, and therefore the emphasis is much more on the kind of education side of things than perhaps the film side of things. I don't know a lot about teaching film to young people, for example, but I've enjoyed listening to that. The other thing I should say perhaps is that a lot of the influence for my work comes from someone called Stanley Cavell, who I literally just heard from Twitter passed away yesterday. But he's an important American philosopher who later in his career, I suppose from about the 1970s, started to look increasingly at film as a way of philosophizing, particularly in the tradition of great American philosophy. So he saw great American Hollywood directors as on a par with the likes of Emerson and Thoreau as philosophers in how they were sort of thinking about the big questions in life. And doing so not just in terms of kind of plot and narrative and content, but very much attentive to the ways that films were being made. And I've tried to apply some of that to my thinking about education. How do films tell us something about what we value in education, such that we can tell that it's still a meaningful practice, I suppose. So that is sort of something by way of introduction to where I've come at this from. And yes, I'll go to the next slide. So the film education thing poses a bit of a conundrum for me, I suppose, because I suppose when I first came to draw up the undergraduate module that I now teach on film as education, that was when I first encountered Bergala's cinema hypothesis, and I read it, and I sort of thought that this was a wonderful book in terms of its passion for cinema and teaching cinema to others, but that the emphasis was very much on cinema and film, and that there was something lacking in terms of an expression of passion or hope for education and its associated phenomena, I suppose. And whilst I'm not under any illusion that our schools are in any great state a lot of the time, I still hold out that kind of hope that they might be, and therefore I'm looking at ways always to improve that situation. And one of the ways that I think that is possible is by looking at films and seeing what they value, some of them, about processes of teaching and learning and schooling in particular, such that these are all ways of valuing education rather than seeing it as something inherently problematic, indoctrinatory, etc. So I think I have something in sympathy with what Alejandro was saying about institutions there, is that increasingly I began to feel that Bergala constructs a picture of schooling, at least, that is really quite negative in relation to what its potential is for doing good in our society, in contrast to film, which has immense potential to do good. But because schools provide the greatest access to all sorts of different media, they are unfortunately and reluctantly the best place for people to have access to films, which it may just be a matter of expression, but I felt that he was doing schooling a slight injustice there, as well as other aspects of education. So these were the questions that I sort of was posing at the beginning, I suppose, of my paper here. In contrast to matters of film pedagogy, what does film reveal about the things we value about education? Is the love of an art for an art's sake sufficient justification for it to be taught in school? I wouldn't say necessarily that it isn't, but I would say that there is more of a question over that than perhaps Bergala allows. And does he overemphasize the importance of the school's role in cultivating cinephilia at the expense of cinema's role in cultivating attitudes towards learning and schooling? Thank you. So he starts with, I'm actually going to kind of read off of this a little bit. Interestingly, I think his book recounts his own kind of educational biography, autobiography rather, which obviously informs a lot of his own position on this, and then I think then informs some of the contradictions in his position that are revealed later on also, because as I've written here, he writes that he's been saved from cultural disinheritance by the twin rewards of cinema and schooling. His boarding school allowed him some kind of independence from his parents to discover who he was away from them, and cinema then allowed him equally an independence from schooling to discover who he was away from that. And both of these things informed the idea that, well, the two really important points, I suppose, that he wants to make about cinema is that it's primarily an art, and the other concern that he doesn't think that anyone should be disenfranchised from the experience of cinema through education, which may be a really important point as well, but it doesn't necessarily make an argument for cinema over all sorts of other media. In fact, I think in my first draft of this paper, I made the really facetious example of, well, why should anyone be disenfranchised from the possibility of making model aeroplanes? And, you know, why shouldn't that be universally taught in schools? So I tried to think of how you could make this justification that cinema should have a special place in everyone's education and not model aeroplanes. That didn't make it to the final cut. Can I have the next slide? So my critique, I suppose, of Bergala from this point tries to just follow the four stages that he sets up for teaching cinema in schools. The subtitle of the book is Teaching Cinema in the Classroom. And I decided to follow his four things there as a way of testing my own views on what was valuable about education whilst he was trying to make the case for cinema, I suppose. So the first one he says is the setting up the possibility for an encounter with films. And this is very much the kind of democratic impetus, I suppose, that says everyone should have access to this opportunity. As I think others have already mentioned, you know, despite the kind of universal claim for teaching cinema in schools, I think that Bergala's own reference to his autobiography suggests that context is extremely important in all of this, and the way that we encounter these things for the first time matters according to who is teaching them and where we are being taught, not just the fact that we do have those things available to us. He also says his own philosophy is informed by the childhood experience of going alone each Sunday afternoon with total freedom to see a film of my choosing, about which I kept absolutely silent. And this conflicts somewhat with my picture of what is valuable about education, at least as a formal institution, and its possibilities. Because he, as I think Alejandro also mentioned, is talking about this individual experience of cinema, which sometimes doesn't, for him, need any outward expression. And yet, I sort of feel that if we are to make an argument for something called education as opposed to something called experience, for example, and not to kind of conflate those two things, then education is usually something that happens together, especially in schools, and it's a part of learning how to be together and learning how to share things with one another. And therefore, the staying silent on these matters may be something that is valuable outside of that. But I think in the education, the formal education environment, that maybe should be less of an option. Because schooling should maybe still retain its public orientation. That is, its orientation towards citizenship as much as anything else. So, what I said at the end here, in wanting to preserve the best of both worlds here, Bergala risks denying their mutual compatibility. If a public or democratic education is not just about equality of access, that is, everyone has equality of access to have a private experience, that sits uncomfortably with me in some ways. So beginning to understand issues of community instead, such that we can think of films in terms of not just cultivating an inner world, but as a way of relating one's own experience to that of others in the world. Can I have the next one? Thanks. Okay, so again, Alejandro has mentioned a little bit about this. Let me know when I'm going over time. So I won't say an awful lot about the passeur because I think that has been effectively treated. But again, the passeur is constructed somewhat against this more anodyne figure of the teacher, and I was trying to question in the paper whether that's a very helpful sort of a construction. He talks about how his own symbolic status changes. He abandons for a moment his role as an educator, as that role has been defined and delimited by the institution. And suddenly, you know, this figure is transcending everything about the institution. That means that in the abandonment of an educational role, the passeur then reinforces this binary distinction between art and life, the filmic and the educational. Whereas I think there is opportunity for the two to be mutually enhancing and mutually beneficial. Okay, the next bit is learning to go to the movies, which he says is not a physical action of going to the cinema, but an attitude towards film which is necessary for its appreciation. Again, the school is seen as kind of antithetical to the creative endeavours of film education, but with the reluctant admission that perhaps it's the only way that it can be brought about. For me, when he says the school should not compete with the laws of entertainment and must escape the otherness of the artistic encounter, this also seems to kind of deny the fact that you can take pleasure in films in all sorts of ways, and perhaps the pleasure that we do take in film and the entertainment can be part of the educational and the artistic encounter as well. So here lies the problem of film for film's sake. Because, and maybe this is a point for discussion, there is really very little logic in arguing that schools have an obligation to raise people who will fall in love with cinema. There is more logic in the view that schools might ideally be places where people fall in love with learning, and that film might play an important role in that process. So this is all kind of I suppose, a defensive education that looks at Bergala's setting up of the school as something that is only reluctantly conceded as the place for film education to happen. So the argument advances the cause of a wider exposure to films as cultural texts worth exploring, but it doesn't necessarily point beyond an exposure to film as the development of individual tastes and experience in film along with other people, as the public orientation of education might suggest. The counter to this, I've argued, means seeing schools not just as facilitators of film exposure, but as sites that might be transformed by that exposure also. And the last part of the hypothesis is drawing connections between films. I'm not going to dwell very long on this. But he again talks about the best context in which to approach films as belonging to a chain of artworks. Once more, I was just thinking about, well, is there sufficient logic in saying that cultural inheritance is the precise agenda for a film education, and being able to connect the dots from one film to another, and therefore from one film to one artwork, to a painting, to a novel, to another. There's potentially something quite nihilistic in that, unless you can see the relationship of all of those things and the connections of them to one's own existence also. And there is perhaps not sufficient emphasis in the drawing connection part on that aspect there either. So increasingly, film seems to move away as from everyday and ordinary existence to a celebration of art and becoming the cinephile, but then the cinephile is someone who sort of stands outside of life almost. Thank you. The difference between a film philosophy that has emerged out of the writing of Stanley Cavell and the dialectics of film education as explored in Bergala is that the former says more about the uniqueness of film and its ability to draw connections to other aspects of existence than the latter does in trying to preserve that uniqueness by drawing connections between films. It feels almost as if a world of art is being created outside of our everyday and ordinary existence, whereas there may be more opportunity through dialogue, and this is one area where I think that language has a really important role to play in making connections between films and the lives that we ordinarily lead. And that's why I'm interested in films that look at educational situations and think about educational ideas as a way of discussing with my own students, is this what you see in your ordinary lives? So without wanting to deny the relationship between film and the other arts, I want to suggest that the educationality of film lies in it being the best medium for making connections back to our own lives, in which our formal education plays an important part, rather than it being seen, film being seen as a chain of extraordinary achievements. Okay. The subtitle to Bergala's book is Teaching Cinema in the Classroom and Beyond. As I said, that there is much, I think, to celebrate about Bergala's passion for cinema and how it can be communicated to young people in the book. But sometimes that is at the expense of how cinema might have something to teach the classroom also. How it might change the way that we relate to our educational institutions. If the cinema hypothesis represents a sophisticated plea for cinephilia as an educational goal, it's not to the detriment of cinema. A film education, according to Bergala's method, can only encourage more young people to take an interest in film, both in its appreciation and its creation. However, there is a sense throughout the cinema hypothesis that formal education, the school, exists only in service to cinephilia. And given that a large part of our lives are spent in schools, couldn't it be valuable also to see film as a starting point for conversations around how young people see their education and how it might be otherwise? Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis. If Cary, Alejandro and Alexis could come and sit at the front as a in panel format, we have 10 minutes. Okay, we have 10 minutes for discussion. And in order to capture it all, if you stick your hand up, I'll come and hand you the microphone so we can capture your question as well as their answers. Lots of food for thought.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks for those excellent presentations. Yeah, my name's Andy Kennedy and I'm working with Scottish Film Education in classrooms, teaching the language of film predominantly. And I'm a filmmaker also, and an artist, and I teach in an art school as well. So some of this is very interesting for me. We're talking about a complex set of images and sounds that are put together in some form to illustrate, explain, educate, create imagination, offer new insights, I guess, and lots of a whole list of things that people might take from an experience like that. I'm particularly interested in, sorry, I'm just looking up your name to get it correct, in Cary's work. I think, Cary, your work's fascinating, working with such young children. I'm particularly interested in what you said about the idea of people being too innocent to resist. And my question is, are adult filmmakers using complex psychology and data analytics, for example, and I mean adult filmmakers as in working in any form of film, including advertising, are they using these forms to create engagement? And is this something that we need to be aware of when we look at the experiences of young children and growing children while engaging with this media?
Are you not taking questions one at a time?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. I have no time to think about it then. I'm not really quite sure I understand the question. I think, I mean, first of all, I'll just take the two bits because I didn't quite see how they fitted together. I mean, when I talked about, adults imagining children as being vulnerable to, the influence of movies because, they're too innocent and too emotional to deal with it. I mean, that was poking a finger at what I left out of my presentation, which is a whole diatribe about the way in which almost the entire discourse, both in the sort of public sphere and in the academy about children and media, is tied into what I call the risks and benefits paradigm. So you can only think about children in relation to a whole range of media, including movies, in terms of is it good for them or is it bad for them, which I think is an extraordinarily limiting kind of thing to ask. But in regards to it, are filmmakers deliberately trying to engage the audience? I thought, yeah, that can't be what you said, was it? Okay, I think yes. Well, not just that, I mean, any filmmaker will presumably be wanting to engage, almost any filmmaker wanting to engage an audience.
Just curious how that balances, in your opinion, about when we're assessing children's behaviour. Are we aware of the complex psychology that's beneath the surface? I mean, do we understand even ourselves?
No.
Thank you very much. That was succinct.
Richard Kilbourne. I'm a retired lecturer from the University of Stirling, Film and Media Department. Also, Cary, you'd be interested to learn that as someone who did the master's course in film and television for education at the Institute back in the early 1980s. It's a question for you, really. I go along with much of what you have to say, and like you, as a grandparent, have been checking out my own grandchildren's responses to media text, And, the point you made about the differentiation that young kids make between the media world and the real world, I think is quite important. But also the point you made about how very young kids are cued into the responses of adults, and there's sort of a bit of participatory observation going on here. I took my 2.5-year-old some time ago to watch a film. I've forgotten the title of the film, but 10 minutes into and she was sitting on my lap, 10 minutes into the film, a villainous character appeared on screen, and like any good grandfather, I sort of pretended to be rather scared, put my hands in front of my eyes, and this elicited a very interesting response from little Bella. She turned round and whispered to me, "No need to be afraid, Grandpa. It's only pretend," you see. And I thought that was I'd almost signed her up for a media studies course immediately there and then. But this point about, perhaps you'd like to say something about the ways in which children are very carefully studying the responses of parents and relatives, people they're watching the media text with.
I don't think they are carefully studying them, actually. I think it's part of the sort of, I've called it sort of the oral ensemble in the room. They're looking at the screen, they're listening to what's coming from the screen, but there are other things going on around them, which they may or may not pick up. And I don't have enough evidence, enough data to say, to make any generalizations about how that works. I mean, I've just observed things where one of the children picked something up from a fortnight earlier and clearly was remembering it and applying it to her reviewing of the film. And again, I think my sense would be with your granddaughter that she already had that as a comforting way of dealing with, that her parents had said to her, or other adults had said to her, or older siblings maybe, "Don't worry, it's only pretend." That's a very common comforting sort of distancing kind of trope that gets used with little kids. I'm interested that she applied that. She might just as well have said, "Oh God, you're scared too. What am I going to do?" Who knows? You said something earlier. Did I cover that? You said something earlier. That was it. Yeah.
Thanks very much. One here.
Hi, Sharon Sorensen. I'm a film educator, animator and artist. I too am interested in your work, Cary, with young children. Sorry. I was interested in the notion of a particular viewing being used up. From looking at my own children, my youngest son had a particular fascination with My Neighbour Totoro from about the age of 2. And he would watch it on loop on an almost daily basis, sometimes several times in a day. And invariably that's a much more complex piece of work than, say, Peppa Pig or In the Night Garden. And it's longer, there's more to gain, there's more scenes and sequences to become interested in and learn from. But it's a film that has stayed, he's nearly 13 now, and it's a film that has stayed with him. He's in no way yet used that up. And I'm interested in how old your grandchildren are now, and if they were to revisit some of the things that had felt to have been used up at that point, what their interest in viewing and the experience of that would be now. I'm breaking my chair.
Thank you. I'm really impressed that you got a kid a 2-year-old to watch through My Neighbour Totoro. I tried that out on these two. Probably they were 2.5 or older. First of all, they were pretty frightened by the dust bunnies. That was pretty bad. But the noise that they both extremely sensitive to very loud noises. They can't deal with a Dyson dryer in a public toilet. Even now, okay? So the noise the Totoro makes when it first, and its mouth opens up like that, they would start to get worried at least good, 5 or 10 minutes before that happens in the film, and say, "I don't want to watch it anymore, I don't want to watch it anymore." I do have I have to tell this, a lovely image from that, when, I hope everybody else knows the film, because I'm not going to explain it now, but anyway, there's a scene at the end of the film where the kids are sort of magically in a tree, maybe they're there, maybe they're not, and the mother, who is in hospital, talking to the father, and somehow she looks round and thinks she sees the children in the tree and tells her husband this, and he said, maybe they really were there, because look, and she finds something. He finds something it's a corn cob that has come. We know one of the children was carrying. Well, I have a video of the kids. They did watch it a few times, actually. They gradually sort of managed to brace themselves to deal with it. But Alfie said earlier in that sequence, they're going to throw something. Now, you don't see them throw anything. but he's anticipating something that's not there in the narrative. So fitting in, things not shown in the narrative. I can't remember where that got me. What was the second thing? When used up. They have gone back to some things. There's a bit of sort of, God, not that again, and I'm, a lot of it was just talking about things that, Peppa Pig, they're not going to bother going back to that. That wouldn't be cool. They're 8 now. They wouldn't go back to Tree Fu Tom. Those were things that were major challenges for them when they were 2.5. Done that, been there. Now it's Minecraft, day in, day out.
Thank you very much. My name's David Sorfer. I teach film theory and philosophy here at the University of Edinburgh, but mainly at master's and PhD level. So I want to just shift the questions basically to Alexis and to Alejandro and perhaps to older people. And this is just a very general question about Alejandro, this talking about cinema being shown in a proper place and so on. What I've noticed, I'd say, over the past 3 or 4 years is that now my students are supposedly advanced postgraduates. They are less and less interested in coming to see films that we screen. I'd say over a 10-week course, attendance drops from 80% to 10%. Almost inevitably in every class. And I wonder what your sense of that is, and Alexis, yours as well, this kind of, whether that's a problem or not, and whether we should just stop screening films and just say, well, that's fine, just watch it on your phone, or in a as illegal and corrupted form as possible, and that's fine. And I wonder what your take on that kind of shift in culture away from the cinema might be.
It's an interesting question because it connects something that I thought when I heard your presentation, this idea of basically education. You mentioned that Bergala says basically, so I kept the film experience to myself, and you're saying that doesn't really go together well with the concept of education. And I think for me this is a connection to the idea of a cinema space, because I think it might have drowned a little in what on all of the things I was trying to say. I was not trying to say basically we want to teach them that cinema is the best space, but we want to make them aware of the fact that cinema is a different space from the spaces they normally watch films at. And for example, in Bergala's theory, this doesn't really seem to be a topic, because he has this idea of a DVD, basically making it possible to draw all of these connections. And he's not actually talking about the film experience as an experience of many people being in a cinema together. Like specifically to your question, I cannot really say how I evaluate, let's say, this tendency, but I can say that, for example, when I teach at university, I teach in the cinema, and that means I teach in the cinema. I am in the cinema and teach, but we also watch films. So each session is 4 hours long and consists of 2 hours of watching a film and 2 hours of being inside a cinema. And the response I get in these seminars, which normally have 50 students, is extremely positive, like really extremely positive. But what they also treasure and value is the fact that I say watching films is part of the seminar. It's not like you do it at home and then we meet in the seminar. The seminar is watching films together. And so I try to do like these small things, or I did a small lecture for 15-year-olds entitled Cinema is a Political Space, in which for 2 hours we watch films of scenes that play in a cinema and discuss what is special about cinema. So basically what I'm trying in film education is to make them aware of the fact that there's a difference of watching something together with people that you don't know inside a space and watching them at home with your brother inside of a TV. So I try to at least make them sensitive for this difference.
Who chooses the films?
In the educational things I do, and I think it's very important that I do, because the idea of choosing your own films is the idea of Netflix and the idea of the internet, which I don't think is a bad idea, but I think part of my responsibility, there I'm very much with Bergala, part of my responsibility as a teacher or an educator or a passeur is making choices that they have to deal with. So.
Yeah, and maybe also surprising people because they haven't had the choice. If you have a choice, maybe that doesn't surprise you quite so much. I noticed I have completely different... I basically use films in some of my teaching sometimes. I think I get much better responses to that than I do almost to another initiative that I run called the Film Forum at the university, where we try and show all sorts of different independent and unusual forms of world cinema to which almost no one comes. And that's very dispiriting. But whereas in class, I can show all kinds of things to students, and because they're unexpected, but because they think it's part of their curriculum, they suddenly discover that it's something that they could take an interest in, and they'd be like, I've never watched a black and white movie before, but actually they can be really good. But I think one of the important things about that is not just the viewing experience, but then the conversations that we try and have afterwards. In some ways, being able to sort of build that around something that doesn't entail the risk of sort of, oh, have I got this right or have I got this wrong? But is rather just a discussion around people's impressions of things. Sometimes proves a lot more fruitful than the whole, some of the debates that we have in Film Forum around, what are the big issues in the films that we've been looking at. So I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but that's how it sort of features in my practice, I guess.